Well, as I say, it's hard to fight evil until you know just how strong it is, how pervasive it is, and the full story has never been realized on the Manson family until now. The Shadow over Santa Susana. Adam Go Rightly joins us. Hey, Adam.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
Well, and thank you too for writing this book. I thought I knew tons about the Manson family, and I feel like an idiot. There's so much in here. Now, I want to point out up front too, again, kind of like our book last hour. This may not be for everybody. I mean, you tell the stories very frankly in this book. You don't pull a lot of punches, and there are some photographs that I've never seen or even knew it existed. Are some of these crime scene photographs, and some of these are autopsy photographs. How did you get permission, or where did you even get these photos that appear in the book?
Quite graphic photos, and the publisher was able to get a hold of a lot of those. They are crime scene photos and autopsy photos, and some of them have been published in previous books. I assume a lot of this stuff is public domain.
No, I maybe I haven't read all of those books on the. I thought I'd read a lot, but you caught me off guard with a lot of this material, and it's fascinating. And the book is "The Shadow over Santa Susana: Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos." I want to put off some of the darker stuff for just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And since we played that Beach Boys song at the beginning of the hour that Charles Manson had written and the Beach Boys had recorded, it reminded me of the story that you recount in your book, which I was just telling somebody 2 weeks ago before the movie Public Enemies opened with John Dillinger, because of the connection with another famous gangster from that era, Alvin Creepy Karpis. And I was so glad you put that in your book, because I was telling people about this connection between Charles Manson and Alvin Creepy Karpis of the Ma Barker gang, and nobody believed me. So I can now show them your book.
Part of Charlie's formative years when he was in reformatory schools and later in prisons, those were his teachers and mentors, and one of them was Alvin Creepy Karpis, like you said, former Public Enemy #1, member of the Ma Barker gang, and oddly enough, Karpis taught Charlie how to play guitar, and
in prison.
Yeah.
And he commented, Creepy Karpis said at the time that, he thought that Charles Manson was a punk, and he was going to teach him guitar because he wanted to learn how to play guitar. And he said that Manson had this attitude like he was going to be bigger than the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, what an interesting kind of foreshadowing that if Alvin Creepy Karpis hadn't taught Charles Manson how to play the guitar, then maybe the events of the Manson family might never have happened.
I've never looked at it like that, but that's a good point. That was part of his entrance, into the rock and roll world. He made some contacts while in prison, actually. A guy named Phil Kaufman. This was in, around 66, 67, right before Charlie got released from Terminal Island Prison in San Francisco. This guy, Phil Kaufman, heard him playing guitar, and he said, "Hey, Charlie, I know some contacts at Universal Studios. When you get out, I'll give you their names, and you can look them up." And from there, once Charlie got released on the infamous date of 9/11, 1967,
right.
he recorded some demo sessions there at Universal Studios. So that was part of his entrance into that world, was his musical abilities, such as they were.
Well, and that, just even to push that point a little bit further, if Alvin Creepy Karpis, former Public Enemy #1, who in his own right was pretty evil in his day, he had that really super creepy smile, which he seemed to take a certain amount of pride in, kind of a twisted fellow in his own right. If he hadn't taught Charles Manson how to play the guitar, Manson might not have gotten the legitimacy that the later music and showbiz contacts that Charles Manson had. And if he hadn't gotten that kind of legitimacy, he might not have attracted the people that he attracted.
Oh, no doubt. And he, also used his guitar playing, and he was a decent lyricist. That was probably his strong suit, and vocally, he was kind of a second-rate lounge singer type. But this is how he met a lot of his young women. For instance, the first recruit into the Manson family, Mary Bruner, saw Charlie outside of the Berkeley Public Library. She was a librarian there playing his guitar and got entranced by his music and this what she saw as a magical little man who had a lot of answers.
Well, and this magical little man eventually obviously got to be friends with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and was able to kind of sucker Dennis Wilson into the Manson family through these sex orgies, which Charlie offered up whenever he wanted. But then also even ingratiating himself a little bit with Brian Wilson, which after the whole Manson family thing, I remember distinctly reading that the Wilson family barely had any contact with Charlie and that they thought he was weird and they tried to get away from him as fast as possible. But when I'm reading your book, I realized, no. They were absorbed by Charlie Manson for a long time before they finally pushed away from the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how that all came about, the Manson-Wilson connection. A couple of Manson's girls, Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the murderers, one of the Tate LaBianca murderers, and another gal named Marnie Reeves, were out hitchhiking one day on the Pacific Coast Highway, and Dennis Wilson picked them up, took him back to his pad to, quote-unquote, show him his gold records, and had sex with both of them. So they found out where Wilson lived, off of Sunset Boulevard. And so later, Wilson, sometimes afterwards, Wilson came back from an all-night recording session, and there was a party going on in his house, and it's the Charlie's girls all in various states of undress, and Manson walked out as Wilson pulled up and pulled one of his stunts where he got down on his hands and knees and kissed his feet and welcomed Wilson into his own house. And so, that was a very appealing scene for a lot of these rock and rollers, this semi-guru messiah guy with this band of young sexually promiscuous women, and Charlie had drugs as well available. It was he used this was his MO to suck people into his scene, such as Dennis Wilson.
Well, and then I thought, to extend the story a little bit further, they record this song later on. The Beach Boys record this song written by Charles Manson, and Manson achieves a level of legitimacy within recording circles that you mentioned in the book. You actually have articles where, like Dennis Wilson is bragging about signing, Charles Manson potentially to, the label that the Beach Boys had started. And other people within the recording business are touting this unknown talent, this guy who's on the rise, this guy who is sort of talking about him like he's going to be the next Dylan. And you think, well, this guy he had a lot of people under his spell that I would never have imagined would have fallen for it. But in particular, I like the story that I'd never heard before, and I'm a Beach Boys fan, and I read a lot about the Beach Boys. I've never heard this story about Brian Wilson and that song that scared him to death. Can you talk about that?
It's the song called Fire, I believe.
Yeah.
If memory serves correct. And it was part of those Smile sessions that was going on during this period. It was 67, 68. Brian Wilson was trying to break away from the typical Beach Boy music as we know it and get into more psychedelic and, that type of music, and one of these songs was called Fire, which he recorded with a full-scale orchestra, and this was during that whole period where Manson was kind of hovering around them all. And as I recall the anecdote, they recorded it one night, and short time afterwards, and a building nearby caught on fire, and Wilson was concerned, and he believed that he had basically done some type of ritual magic incantation with that music, and so he went ahead and destroyed those tapes.
Now, hold on a second. Now, I'll refresh your memory in your book for you. It wasn't just the fact that while he recorded that song, the next day he found out the building next door to the recording studio had burned down. Over the next couple of days he worked on that song, he also discovered that there had been a series of forest fires that had spontaneously developed at the same time and were threatening the whole community. And he was convinced that those two songs, that the song and the fires had a connection. But as I remembered from your book, he didn't destroy it. He just merely had the song buried in the archives, and that the tape may exist somewhere, but it's never seen the light of day. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, true. I guess that sounds right. I think the phrase that jumps in my head now, that he locked it away in the Capitol vaults.
Yeah.
He never wanted it to be played again. So maybe it's still out there. You know, those Smile sessions. I don't know if you're familiar with those. That's some great stuff.
Yeah, I own the album. This is the famous psychedelic album from mostly Brian Wilson that Capitol didn't allow them to release. And wasn't finished until recently, and now it's out on CD. Now, but this is, again, what's interesting about this is Brian Wilson Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, at a time when he's hanging out with Charles Manson, who's yet to lead his Manson family into the Tate LaBianca murders that are known, so well as the Helter Skelter murders of the late 1960s. So he hadn't actually committed any crimes yet that anybody would have known of, but Brian Wilson had kind of a premonition of just how violent and weird Charles Manson was going to be. And Brian Wilson even banned him from the studio?
He kicked him out of the studio that was actually at his house, where he recorded those Smile sessions, and that's where Dennis Wilson set up some further demo sessions with Charlie and a producer, I believe his name was Steve Desper. But the vibe started getting weird. Manson was pulling out buck knives and these type of things, and they were real, kind of slobs and making a mess of the house, and just a bad scene. And eventually, Wilson gave him the boot.
People who distanced themselves from from Charles Manson kind of did it at their own peril. That there were a lot of people that were catching on to the dark side of Charles Manson, but it took them a while. And one of those people, I thought this was an interesting point you made, Terry Melcher, who was the son of Doris Day, that he too was much more involved with Charles Manson, now that we can look back on a little more honestly, than was alluded to at the time. It was said that Terry Melcher was an acquaintance of Charles Manson. They knew where Terry Melcher lived, but that when he went to the house, Terry Melcher no longer lived in the house, and that's where Sharon Tate lived, and that's why they killed everybody in that house. Now, that's generally known, but tell us the whole story of just how close that contact was between Manson and Doris Day's son, who had become a fairly successful record producer.
Well, yeah, Melcher, he produced some pretty big acts, the Byrds and Paul Revere and the Raiders, who were pretty hot during that period, and he was tight with Dennis Wilson. It was actually Dennis Wilson who turned him on to Manson. As I said, Dennis Wilson really thought quite highly of Charlie at that time, called him his wizard, kind of his mentor. And so Melcher had designs, perhaps, if we believe what Manson said, of recording an album. There was even some type of film in the works for a period of time. One of the first incidents that happened that kind of set off Helter Skelter was a shooting of a black drug dealer named Otsa Papa Crow that Manson was involved in. And it's really the only violent crime, aside from slashing the ear of murder victim Gary Hinman that Manson was involved in. Others executed the murders, but at the scene of this shooting of Lots of Papa, that was his nickname, Lots of Papa Crow, Bernard Crow was a friend of Dennis Wilson's named Brian Lucas, and Brian Lucas informed Dennis Wilson, and Terry Melcher got wind of this in I guess it was late '68, early '69, about this shooting. And at that time, Wilson severed his contact with Manson. At this point, thinking he'd gotten out of control.
Yeah, but Terry Melcher, I mean, Doris Day's son, it seems like after the Tate LaBianca murders, he really, he sets up kind of a very sanitized version of his relationship with Charles Manson, which seemed much more like he was much more interested in him working with him as an artist, and that he too was kind of into this Charles Manson circle of friends or people that were taking advantage of the sexual opportunities of the Manson family girls.
Yeah.
But that story you tell, and I have never heard it before, that Charles Manson went to the mansion where the girls and others would go back to later on and commit the murders, that he was actually there. Was it the day before or the day of the Manson murders? Remember?
I believe it was a short period of time, like the day before.
Okay. And he went there. He went to the mansion looking for whom? Why did he go to the mansion? And he came like this close to actually seeing or talking with Sharon Tate before he would send all those people back to do the killing.
Indeed, yeah, he was there looking for Mr. Melcher.
Now that's way interesting.
Yeah.
And that he had gone there, he had pounded on the door, and they had a butler had come to the door or something and said, "You go away."
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed.
And inside were the future victims of the first round of murders for the Manson family. Well, as you're already hearing, there's just more to this story than you ever been told before. I want to get into the Son of Sam connection, and even into the very unusual connection to the death of John Lennon.
Yeah.
As they all sort of extend out, they all sort of radiate out from Charles Manson. Shadow over Santa Susana, black magic, mind control, and the Manson family mythos. And then I've never heard it explained so well where the theology of Charles Manson came from. What was the combination that went into this unique sort of worldview that worked so well for Charles Manson? I've never heard of the Scientology connection before to Charles Manson, but you'll hear about it next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So we're talking about the pervasive evil, the satanic evil that was Charlie Manson. And we use that term a lot, and true Luciferians may argue and say, well, he wasn't one of us, and you can't use the term satanic around him, except that Charles Manson did. And he thought he was practicing a form of Satanism, but also a form of Scientology. And I've never heard that before. We'll get to that coming up in just a minute. Also, about Terry Melcher, there we played some music from The Byrds that was produced by Terry Melcher, who is also Doris Day's son. And we'll get back to a little bit more of that story, the night that Helter Skelter happened, and what Charles Manson was trying to achieve, what he thought he had the power to do, and where that idea came from that he had the power to do it. It's part of the Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson family mythos next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So let's start with this Scientology thing, because this brings us back into Charles Manson in prison, back when he was learning how to play the guitar from Alvin Creepy Karpus, formerly Public Enemy #1. How did he get into Scientology, and how is that confirmed?
Yeah, as the story goes, and there's various sources for this. The first source I saw was Ed Sanders in his book The Family, talking about the period of time that Manson was at McNeil Island Prison in Washington State. This was in the 50s, during that period where first, the book Dianetics became a pop culture fad and evolved into Scientology, the religion L. Ron Hubbard created. And there was a guy at McNeil Island Prison who had studied under L. Ron Hubbard by the name of Lanier Rainier. And this Rainier fellow, he gathered a group around him that he schooled in Scientology, and Manson was among that group. And according to Charlie, during that period he studied under Lanier Rainier, he ascended to the highest level of Scientology, which is that of a operating Thetan, as it's called. And so there's other stories as well about Manson family and Scientology connections. Apparently, when he got out, and this is material that was undercovered through all different government documents, FBI documents, Manson attended a celebrity center. There's a celebrity center of Scientology in L.A., and they had a banquet there that Manson attended. Also, they found Manson or Scientology material at Spawn Ranch, as well as an e-meter, that device Scientologists use that they hook up to people, and it's a typical thing used in Scientology. One of the most interesting things I heard, and this came from he's a late great conspiracy researcher some of your listeners may know by the name of Jim Keith, wrote a lot of great books. And Keith, who I corresponded with quite a bit during the late 90s when I was writing this book, he had been an executive of Scientology, and then he got out of it, of course. And he was telling me that from within Scientology, he heard that Manson was what is called, quote-unquote, a body router, or what is how they term a recruiter for Scientology. So you have all these little connections, these dangling threads, and that's what I kind of try to do with the book, is to tie them all together. But ultimately it's up to the reader to come to their own decisions. I don't.
Well, but I think if we're going to talk about what the theology was behind Charles Manson and how he was able to manipulate people so well, the Scientology part would be, some of it, but there's also his mix of satanic worship and getting the whole Wicca thing involved in it, that by stirring all these together in kind of a boiling cauldron, he came up with his own brand. It wasn't obviously pure Scientology, but, because all the girls in the group, they all called themselves witches, right?
Yeah. Well, he was using what is known as sex magic. According to the legends, once again, Charlie had incredible staying power, could have sex for hours with these girls, and when he'd recruit a new girl into the family, that's what he'd do with them, and he'd have sex with them to the point where they were just exhausted and would go into a trance state, and that's when he would be able to do his programming. The same with they had some pretty full-scale orgies with LSD, and once again, that he used those to program his folks. He'd bring them all together, and Charlie always gave more acid to his family members than he did to himself, so he could orchestrate and control these proceedings. And this is the same type of mojo that Aleister Crowley was involved with, stirring up these energies through sex magic, tantric sex.
And he considered himself either Jesus Christ or the devil. We've heard him, talk about that even in TV interviews where he's saying, "I'll be whatever you want me to be. I'll be Jesus Christ, I'll be the devil." But this was part of what he was able to do. He did get everybody in his group to start thinking of themselves as witches, and for them to think of him as the devil or as their savior.
The devil and Christ all mixed together in this strange stew where good and evil could coexist with each other. And so it's easy to justify that if everything you do is for the right and for love, as they would say, then there is no wrong.
Adam Gorightly is this author of this book about the shadow over Santa Susana. It's all about Charles Manson and all of these other connections that had come through either Charles Manson's life or the ways in which Charles Manson had gone through other people's life. Let's talk about the Son of Sam connection. It's interesting. I mean, some of these things that you bring up in the book I've just never heard of before, so fill that in for people that don't know. And by the way, too, remember, we're talking about a guy who was convicted of and is still on death row, such as it is. He's a lifer in California in the state prisons for his involvement in the murders of Sharon Tate and several other prominent people at her mansion, an up-and-coming actress, and then also later on at the home of a couple that were owners of grocery stores. So how does this end up becoming a connection to Son of Sam?
Pretty interesting how Berkowitz comes up. First connecting point, perhaps, is to talk about MK Ultra, and the late conspiracy researcher Mae Brussel believed that the Manson family was some type of MK Ultra operations, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of the history of MK Ultra. It was the basically a mind control program that the CIA got involved with in 1952 when it all started. And they used different drugs such as LSD and electric shock therapy to basically see how they could program people and ultimately create Manchurian candidates, programmed killers. And so Mae Brussel, when she was looking into this material, she discovered that, a lot of these operations took place in the military, these LSD, MK Ultra type operations. And Berkowitz was involved in just, one such operation when he was in Korea with the military. He was a profile candidate, and apparently he got this type of indoctrination into this shadowy world, and Mae Brussel called him the son of Uncle Sam. Now, after he got out in the late 70s is when the murders, the Son of Sam murders, took place, and a lot of you, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the story, or what some would say is a cover story that some old dog talked to Berkowitz and instructed him to commit the murders, that he was a nut, another lone nut, like a lot of the killers in political assassinations. Now, later on, a book came out called The Ultimate Evil, where this fellow Maury Terry put together this theory, and he interviewed Berkowitz at length, and Berkowitz claimed that he was a member of a cult and that there were other players involved. And recently, more information has come out. Some of the investigators who are involved in Son of Sam putting forth evidence that there was more than one killer. Anyway, at one point, Berkowitz told a fellow inmate that Manson belonged to this cult that Berkowitz belonged to. Manson was involved with the Los Angeles chapter of this cult and was working on orders from the cult when he directed the Tate LaBianca murders.
Now, and I was just leaning back here and listening to you. There's so much more to that, though, because if Charlie were involved in the L.A. branch of this particular cult, it wasn't the only connection that he had to a cult. Talk about the group that's called The Process.
That Maury Terry in his book gets pretty deep into the Process Church of the Final Judgment, and these connections were first alluded to by Ed Sanders in his book The Family. The Process Church really evolved out of Scientology.
Again, an interesting coincidence, but grew out of Scientology in England.
Right. And the two people that founded Scientology, their names were Robert Moore and Marianne McLean. they got married and changed their last name to de Grimston for some reason. I've never quite figured that one out. And they broke from Scientology. At first, they started a outfit called Compulsions Analysis, I believe it was called. But that evolved. It became more religious, mystical, and they started this occult order called the Process Church of the Final Judgment that basically, like Charlie, they worshiped multiple deities, or they brought the powers of good and evil together. Their followers worship either Lucifer or Satan or Jehovah. One wonders how you can do that, but it seems.
Well, they had a theory, right? That wasn't it the process that said, if Jesus says love your enemy, and the enemy of Jesus was Satan, then you have to love both Christ and Satan.
That sounds right out of the canon of Manson.
Yeah,
and there seemed to be. The more you look into it, there was connections. The process came over to California during the Summer of Love, '67, and landed in the Haight-Ashbury. It's kind of a recruiting trip for them. And oddly enough, they were based on Cole Street, only 2 blocks from where the Manson family was during that period. Later in '68, the family hung out at a place called the Spiral Staircase, where supposedly the Process Church of the Final Judgment also hung out. And
that was a mansion. It was called the Spiral. That was a nickname for this Gothic 2-story mansion that had a winding staircase in the middle.
Yeah, and that's where Charlie said, and this is documented in the book Manson in His Own Words, by the author Neil Emmons. Charlie said that's where everything really spiraled out of control, and his family went on a very dark path, starting with and after meeting some of the people they did there.
Well, because up until that point, Charles Manson makes the point. Up until this one occasion that they should start living in or hanging out with these people that form something called the Process, which is like Scientology once removed. Yeah. Until he starts hanging out with them at this mansion, he looks at himself as kind of a merry prankster. They're dropping acid, they're having sex, but they're not thinking about killing anybody. And it's during that period where things start to get really weird. Mm-hmm. According to Charles Manson, that's when they got weird. And it was things he picked up while he was hanging out in that mansion, which we should mention was also at one time owned by Bela Lugosi, which everybody knows as Dracula. So let's go forward though a little bit in time. Here it is a couple years later, and Charles Manson is already on trial for the Tate LaBianca murders, for these horrible mutilating murders that happened in California, and he's a guest article writer for this magazine that's being put out in England by this group called The Process. They have a popular monthly magazine, and in the publication where they've asked Manson to write an article, on the front cover is Marianne Faithfull, who at the time was Mick Jagger's girlfriend and a well-known pop singer in her own right.
Yeah, the Stones also seem to come up in this story quite a bit, but the title of it was something like Psychoprofundity in Death, penned by Charles Manson. And this, once again, was during the trials. Bugliosi started looking into these Process connections, wondering what the heck was going on. At one time, he asked Charlie, do you know Robert de Grimston? And Charlie said, basically, Robert de Grimston and I are one and the same. Now, a short time after that, a couple members of the Process Church visited Charlie in prison, and no one knows exactly what happened at this meeting, but afterwards he pretty much clammed up for good about the Process Church, and we haven't heard him say anything about it since then.
So, again, it's sort of a weird mix of Satanism, or at least sort of, curbside Satanism, a mix of that, a mix of some Wicca in there, then also Scientology, and this all together swirling around in Manson's mind becomes his own form of religious indoctrination to get people under his spell. And they did think of him as a god. I mean, they did. I mean, his followers, they were totally upside down in Manson. It was just so surprising to think that some magazine in England would be publishing articles that would have, Mick Jagger's girlfriend, posing on the cover, and then have an article from Manson on the inside. It stunned me. And you make the point about how many times Mick Jagger comes up intersecting the life of Charles Manson, and that was surprising.
Let me also mention, the stew we're mixing up here with all these different things, that Eastern religion was part of the whole thing. He wove into it too. That song you played at the beginning, Never Learn Not to Love. The original title was Cease to Exist. The Beach Boys thought that was a little severe, so they toned it down a little bit. But that was part of the theology too, which you got out of Eastern religion, was that to attain a higher level of consciousness and become one with the universe, you had to kill your own ego and cease to exist. Later, those words took on a more ominous overtone.
Sure. Well, coming up, I want to get to the connection with the killer of John Lennon, with Mark David Chapman, as he kind of radiates out from these 6 degrees of Charles Manson, which is essentially what we're talking about in the book, The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. Final thought on that MK Ultra thing. Any other source? Have we been able to look and even maybe, now could it be revealed kind of a application for the government that they would finally tell us whether or not Charles Manson was ever involved in MK Ultra? I mean, is there Freedom of Information Act material available on that? I'm curious.
That's a good one. I'm sure somebody's done a Freedom of Information Act. I think that they'd want to cover that up, but it sounds like we're going to a break. You should ask me about the connection between Sarah Jane Moore and Squeaky Fromm in regards to possible MK Ultra tomfoolery.
Well, let's get to that then coming up next. And also as we making these connections as they continue, some more people that you never would imagine that get connected to Charles Manson and to the Manson family, and just how the evil that was generated by the Manson family lives on in a very sort of palpable way. More on that coming up next hour. The blog is up, too, at coasttocoastam.com. And thanks always for your comments, and enjoy reading those. If you missed crypto news earlier in the evening, very cool ghost stories linked up at coasttocoastam.com on the blog. This is Ian Punnett. It's just interesting to hear even the U2 version of Helter Skelter. And you just know there would never have been Helter Skelter had there not been a Charles Manson. Well, I mean, the Beatles wrote the song regardless, but I just mean the book and the period of time, the murders that are referred to when people think of Helter Skelter, that never would have happened had it not been for Alvin Creepy Karpis, the one of the leaders of the Karpis Barker gang, who did not hesitate to kill anybody who got in his way, even innocent bystanders. Rob banks, hijack, mail trucks, kidnapping, a lot of it done right here in the town where I live, in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Alvin Creepy Karpis did a lot of his most notorious work, and then ends up spending the rest of his life in prison as the last public enemy number 1 to be taken. And when he was captured, his taking him off the streets helped elevate J. Edgar Hoover into a national icon in his own right. So and then later on, Alvin Creepy Karpis goes on to teach Charles Manson how to play the guitar. And he says he kind of thought of him as sort of a punk. And didn't think he was that good, but thought that Charles Manson thought he was very good. And then he said, Charles Manson once told him that he was going to be bigger than the Beatles. And then, of course, we get into back to Helter Skelter. It's just so amazing to think that the Charles Manson influence of evil could continue on to this day, and it does. It's something that's explored in the book The Shadow over Santa Susana. Adam Gorightly is the author. We'll get back to him, and we'll talk about the Mark David Chapman piece of this, the guy who later goes on to kill John Lennon, and how that's tied into this, too, on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So, Adam Gorightly, author of The Shadow over Santa Susana, we're talking about the sentient evil that is Charles Manson and the Manson family to this day. It seems that it's a kind of evil that will never die long after Charles Manson might. Have you ever interviewed Charles Manson yourself, Adam?
I never have. I've been leery of doing that in fear of getting a FBI file taken out on me.
Yeah, you probably already have one anyway. So
That's true.
What you're waiting for. Jump in. The water's great. If you can talk about the connection between, I know you made a point at the top of the hour, so we can go back to that too. But before I forget what I was asking about, the connection between Mark David Chapman and Charles Manson and the Manson family. It's surprising to me.
Well, there's a couple degrees there, but it revolves around John Lennon and his assassination and this whole specter of MK Ultra. Years ago, I wrote an article for Paranoia magazine called "Was the Catcher in the Rye a Mechanism of Control?" And this presented the theory that the Catcher in the Rye, the book itself, was used in the same manner that the Queen of Hearts was in that movie, The Manchurian Candidate. It was a triggering device, kind of that triggered a post-hypnotic command and, sent the killer in that movie, turned him into a mind-controlled assassin. So John Hinckley, in his assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan, was found with a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, as was Mark David Chapman at the Dakota Building. Following the assassination of John Lennon, he was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye.
Well, more than that, though, too, he had actually spent the day doing all of the things that the character Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye did when he was in New York.
Yes.
So he got it. Oh, it's documented. Yeah, he got a taxi ride. He talked to a taxi cab guy. He went to a hotel, same kind of hotel. Talked to the bellboy. He tried to find. He either tried to find or he found a copy of this song called "Little Shirley Beans," which is what Holden Caulfield was going after. I mean, there was just all these weird little not coincidences, all these weird little parallels that he was going after. So it's almost like he was being Holden Caulfield before he went to go kill John Lennon.
And perhaps that was the programming matrix. Who knows for sure. It's then interesting that it happened at the Dakota Building, which is where the movie Rosemary's Baby was filmed by, directed by none other than Roman Polanski. And one thing I've heard recently, there's a part in the film where somebody gets pushed out of a window, falls to the ground, and died. And
right.
That's the same spot where John Lennon was assassinated.
Really?
That's what I've heard.
I thought Lennon was shot right inside the main gate area. There's like a space in between the sidewalk and the first guard booth. Mm-hmm. And he was killed right in between that area. So I don't know how somebody could have fallen to that spot And I thought that the guy that falls out of the window from the Dakota, I thought it was somebody that fell out of another building. But very interesting. All right. Well,
I won't argue with you. I heard this recently, and this isn't included in the book. I need to research that a little further, but I thought that was a little interesting.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, it may be true. It catches me off guard, and it's been a while since I've seen Rosemary's Baby, so that's part of my problem. But all right, but it's the thing about the bullets. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the bullets. And by the way, why would you? How can we? Other than he had a catcher in the rye in his pocket, what else leads you to think that somehow Mark David Chapman had gotten involved in any kind of MK Ultra mind control experiment?
Chapman had a history, like a lot of these guys, different lone nut killers, of traveling, going on extensive travels across the country, and staying at expensive hotels and doing all this stalking with really no visible means of support is one of the common MOs that you see with like James Earl Ray, for instance, and I've read other reports that there's some strange connections with different organizations. One of the things that suggests to me that he was some kind of MK Ultra puppet. He worked as a security guard in Hawaii. And the night he signed out and flew over to the States, he wrote the name John Lennon at the sign-out sheet wherever he was working at as a security guard, suggesting to me that was emblazoned on his mind and that Lennon was his target. I've heard other stories that for a period of time, Chapman was at a psychiatric hospital in Hawaii. That has been rumored, and I say rumored. I have no concrete documentation, but has been rumored as a place where a lot of MK Ultra tomfoolery was going on.
Okay, and now about the bullets. The story about how Mark David Chapman handed a guy these bullets?
Yes, Kenneth Anger.
At least you know I read your book.
Yeah. Well, Kenneth Anger, I mean, that opens up a whole different thing when we talk about who Kenneth Anger was and his connections in the occult community. And
that brings us back to Mick Jagger, too, doesn't it? The Anger connection. Well, all right, so let's set the table for this better. Let's talk about Anger and how he, too, gets kind of spun off from the Manson family.
Yeah, we'll get to the bullets, and it's best to give a little background. Kenneth Anger was a prodigy of Aleister Crowley, experimental filmmaker, was involved in the 60s psychedelic scene.
And Aleister Crowley being the Luciferian, the writer, the personality, kind of the main guy behind the new sort of satanic movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And he was, Anger studied under Crowley, and actually, Anger was a child prodigy actor and got deeply into the occult and was tight with Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan. And during this period, Bobby Beausoleil, a future Manson family murderer, in fact, committed the first Manson family murder of Gary Hinman. Prior to that, Beausoleil himself was kind of a musical prodigy, has a lot of connections, knew a lot of people like Manson did some pretty prominent names, and was quite a talented musician to this day. Anyway, Anger ran across Beausoleil in the Haight-Ashbury and thought he was quite talented, and basically tapped him to play the role of Lucifer in a movie called Invocation of My Demon Brother that was filmed around 66 or so, and also included Anton LaVey in the movie. So that's part of an occult background there that Kenneth Anger had with Manson family people. And we can get into other connections that Anton LaVey had. But the incident you're talking about, there was a screening for a movie, or flash forward to 1980, called Lucifer Rising, which Bobby Beausoleil, while in prison, wrote the soundtrack for. This was a Kenneth Anger production, and during like one of the screenings for that, Mr. Chapman showed up one time, handed Anger a bullet, and said, "This is for John Lennon." Anger was friends with John Lennon.
And he handed him a bullet and said, "This is for John Lennon." I think what's so interesting about that is it's so totally out of the blue. And Bobby Beausoleil, you'll have to explain then the connection between Kenneth Anger, Bobby Beausoleil, and Charles Manson.
As far as a connection there, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Okay, all right, well, fair enough. Have you ever heard the story that Aleister Crowley, who, again, Luciferian Aleister Crowley, was a member of British intelligence?
Mm-hmm.
There was a book we had on Coast to Coast called Secret Agent 666, and it was all about what Aleister Crowley knew, how he was involved. I'm not saying that there's a connection between Aleister Crowley, MK Ultra, and all of these assassin groups out there, but isn't that also an interesting connection that it goes back to, somehow a guy, as you're saying, like Mark David Chapman, who might have been programmed to become a killer, was working or went to go see the work of a guy who was working with a guy who was a known British intelligence officer. I don't know. The connections of this just keep kind of spinning around and around in a very tight circle.
The connections between the occult and the intelligence community go back way back to Dr. John Dee, the Elizabethan magician, who was kind of a influence for Aleister Crowley, and it's been rumored for quite a while that a lot of the intelligence agencies target these occult groups, and it's a breeding ground for possible MK Ultra, or even get into the legend of the Monarch mind control programming and how they use satanic ritual as part of that whole programming matrix. So
right.
Intelligence agencies and the occult world of the occult are deeply intertwined, and I get into that quite a bit in the book.
Well, and this is just one of, again, these sort of 6 degrees of separation things, but
it's less than 6 degrees with Manson. It's more like a couple of degrees.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. But this one's a little bit longer, but bear with me.
Uh-huh.
So we mentioned Anton LaVey was in this movie, and Anton LaVey was connected with Aleister Crowley and the Luciferian movement. Mm-hmm. Anton LaVey brought Jane Mansfield into the Church of Satan, right?
Yeah.
You with me so far? The former American actress, or the late American actress Jane Mansfield, and she was a hot actress and a big, beautiful woman. And just to tie this into our first hour guest, I don't know if you heard, we had a guy on who was a famous roadie for Jimi Hendrix and for the Animals and for Elvis Presley and some others. And he tells the story in his book about how he turned down the advances of Jane Mansfield one night because he was trying to stay faithful to his wife. So it's like, wow, it's just weird how everything kind of sometimes interconnects like that. Anyway, so
let's talk about LaVey a little bit, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
There's another connection. He had this early connection between Kenneth Anger and Anton LaVey and Bobby Beausoleil. Kind of during that same period, LaVey was based in San Francisco, and he'd started his Church of Satan during that period, and he was kind of a carnival huckster type, and he started what he called a Witches' Sabbath review at a go-go club, kind of a burlesque type of deal where he, put on a play and with different go-go dancers, strippers, And one of those in this play was none other than Susan Atkins, another future Manson family murderess who played the role of a vampire with mock blood dripping from her lips. This was like 66 or so. It was only 3 years later when she licked the blood from the knife that killed Sharon Tate.
Well, and the connection I just wanted you to make was how Bobby Beausoleil is connected to Charles Manson, in that he was convicted of killing the music teacher and a fellow associate of another Manson family guy, Gary Hinman.
Mm-hmm.
And so he too was this sort of, so again, it comes back down to, it's just this evil that just floated around Southern California. And it just seemed...
Part of it was wrapped up as well, as I talk about, in the drugs. That Hinman murder resulted from a drug burn that Bobby Beausoleil was kind of a middleman. This Hinman was cooking up MDA, and Beausoleil was working as a middleman and sold it to a biker group, and the biker group got sick, so they came back to Beausoleil for the money. Beausoleil went back to Hinman, and Beausoleil was a young man at that time, and the whole thing kind of swirled out of control, and Bobby stabbed Hinman to death when he wouldn't give up the money to pay back the bikers. But once again, these connecting links. Hinman was friends with Dennis Wilson, so through Hinman, Beausoleil became friends with Wilson. This was even before Charlie became tight with Dennis Wilson.
And as I understand it, even in prison, Bobby Beausoleil is still recording music to this day?
He is a very talented musician. Back in, it was the late 70s that Kenneth Anger produced, over a 10-year period, he was putting together this movie called Lucifer Rising. And originally, the guy who wrote the score for it was Jimmy Page, another person who's tied up with Aleister Crowley.
In the Church of Satan. So,
I was going to say that it was while in prison that Beausoleil wrote the score for this Lucifer Rising movie, which is available and recorded a couple albums since then. A very talented musician.
And convicted murderer who was given a death sentence, but still sits in prison in California.
They all got commuted shortly after they were convicted.
And what's interesting is how many of the stars, be it Terry Melcher, Mick Jagger, the Beach Boys, I think you can kind of see in the story arc of their lives when all of this murder breaks out, all this horrible mass murder happens, and they had gone in and out of the lives of the Manson family associates or the Manson family itself, that they suddenly realized that you can't play at evil like this without getting sucked into it entirely.
They all have a price to pay, yes.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain point where they suddenly went like, whoa, let's back off all of this satanic stuff. All right, so coming up then after in just a minute, let's get back to the MK Ultra and to what degree all of the Manson family murders could have been part of some sort of mind control. Next on Coast to Coast AM. Well, there's all sorts of weird little stories about the life of Charles Manson that you may never have heard before, about the Manson family influence. One thing was the idea that Manson was himself a hitman for the mob, along with his CIA connection. And if that sounds far-fetched, wait till you hear more on that story coming up in just a minute. Also, some of the oddest aspects of the horrible nights of the murders revealed for the first time, I think, or at least I've never heard of them before, in the book The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. More on that mind control piece next, too, on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Again, I want to remind people what I said earlier. This is a book that's not fit for everybody's reading. It's filled not only with graphic descriptions of what really happened with the Manson family, how he really effectively did control other people's minds, but also photographs from that I've never seen before, but they were both of the murder scene and of seems to be police photos too of later autopsy results. But you'll get a better idea of all the things that truly were evil about the Manson family in this book, The Shadow over Santa Susana. Adam Gorightly is with us. So of all of the star connections, I think we forgot to mention Neil Young, supposedly being a big fan of Charles Manson, that Charles Manson had also been an inspiration to the music of Neil Young, either during or shortly after his years with the Buffalo Springfield. Is that right?
Yeah, Charlie ran around in that crowd, that Topanga Canyon, Laurel Canyon scene. You know, that's where all the stars were moving to in that period in L.A. to kind of get out of the city into a more rural setting, and that's where Manson and his bunch gravitated to. And you know, among that crowd were the Mama Casses of the world, and John Phillips, and Neil Young. And Neil Young's gone on record as saying that he thought Manson was a talented lyricist. He admired his spontaneous style of songwriting. I don't know how much time they spent together, but apparently Neil Young gave Charlie a motorcycle at one point, so they were knowledgeable of each other. And Manson later, Neil Young ended up later writing a couple of songs about the Manson family scene, one of them called Revolution Blues.
And could that be the same motorcycle that Charles Manson was riding in Kentucky, or was that Charles Manson? But there's a very interesting legend about a Manson-like character in Kentucky being followed behind by these devoted girls, just like the Manson family women would have done.
Yeah, I found that a pretty interesting story. I remember the source was a guy named Jim Todd, who was a reporter out in those parts, looked into this story. A little background. Charles Manson's father was a guy named Colonel Scott. And soon after Manson was born, Colonel Scott split the scene, and his mom hooked up with a guy named Manson, hence his surname. But Colonel Scott, this character Colonel Scott, was Manson's father. And during a period in, I think it was like sometime in '68, Manson was gone for a while. His parole officer didn't know where he was, and the theory was that Charlie went to Kentucky for a while. During the same period in Kentucky, a guy named Darwin Scott died, who was Charlie's father's brother. There were reports that this guy named the Preacher was running around with a motorcycle in Kentucky and giving kids acid, and somebody claimed that this was Charles Manson, and that Susan Atkins was seen with him there in Kentucky.
Mm.
There's a lot of unexplained murders connected to the case.
And unexplained murders being that there seemed to be a pattern to this, but no evidence to directly link it back to the Manson family. But it sure looked like a crime that they would have committed if they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. M.O.
And that's also in the book, The Shadow over Santa Susana. So, all right. So back to the idea of mind control. We know that Charles Manson himself practiced a very sophisticated, very effective form of mind control, and he could manipulate almost anybody. There were some people that seemed to be completely resistant to him. His old prison roommate, who just kept telling him, like, Charlie, cut it out. You're not going to get me. Cut it out.
Yeah.
But there were others that were just completely, they had no natural resistance to Charles Manson. So we know that he was really good at doing it himself. Why? How do you imagine that Manson himself then had fallen into the mind control, the prison that he was in, and then why would he keep being used after? What would be the point of him committing these murders under the influence of the CIA's MK Ultra program?
Boy, that's one rabbit hole there. Let me give you a bit of an overview, and that's kind of how I got interested in this subject. I mean, as a youth, I was taken by the Manson story. I grew up in the 60s, and it wasn't later until the late 90s I started hearing these conspiracy theories revolving around the Manson family case, and in particular the whole mind control MK Ultra thing. And this came initially from a researcher by the name of Mae Brussel. It's pretty well known. She's kind of the matron saint of conspiracy researchers. Did a lot of great work, actually. Was really the first one to get an inkling what was going on with the Watergate case. She kind of blew that open before a lot of people did. And with the Manson family murders, May believed that it was some type of MK Ultra military mind control experiment thing, and that there was basically a design behind all of this to bring about what she called the strategy of tension, and that it was basically the Manson family murders were arranged to bring down the 60s counterculture and the anti-war movement, and in much the same way, you know, that some have suggested 9/11 was orchestrated to erode our civil liberties and bring about a new world order. So that's kind of Mae Brussel's basic thesis.
Right.
Now, it lines up with the MK Ultra that was going on in the Haight-Ashbury during the period Manson was there in '67. There was safe houses set up by a guy named Louis Jolyon West, who's legendary in MK Ultra lore, and also Manson's first parole officer was a guy named Dr. Roger Smith, who ran the Haight-Ashbury clinic that was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health that received money from MK Ultra. Was kind of a front for MK Ultra funding. So I laying a lot of stuff on here.
Well,
and I don't think I answered your question completely.
Well, you know what? Actually, you hit on something else I wanted to get to, so it's a good time. So Manson's follow this connection, everybody. Manson's former parole officer, who oddly enough, it seems strange to mention it, but Manson seemed to do a pretty good job staying in contact with his parole officers. He, for all of his wildness, he didn't buck the system there, and he always made sure to give them an address like he was required to do by law. A lot of that time, it was Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys place that he was listing as his address. All right, so stay with me and correct me where I get this wrong, Adam. Mm-hmm. So Manson's former parole officer ends up opening a mental health clinic in Haight-Ashbury, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people that funded the clinic was the mother of one of Charles Manson's victims.
Yeah, Abigail Folger's mother, and her first name escapes me right now, but she was involved with fundraisers at the Haight-Ashbury clinic. And at some of these fundraisers, I have heard and read in certain places, the Manson family members attended some of these fundraising parties.
But how weird is that? That the former, Charles Manson's former parole officer starts a clinic that ends up being funded by Abigail Folger's mother, and Abigail Folger was one of the poor, seemingly happenstance victims that was staying with Sharon Tate at the house that used to be rented by Terry Melcher, the producer Terry Melcher, who Manson was still connected with, at least tangentially, business-wise, when he goes into the house to commit the murders, or sends his group in to commit the murders.
It's fascinating. I hadn't thought of this before, but I'm visualizing a one of those charts connecting different people, and this would be a fascinating one.
You know what? If you've never done that before, I wish you would. Mm-hmm. I mean, you should put it on a website somewhere and just showing, the 6 degrees of Charles Manson. In some cases, these jumps are just 2 degrees or even 1 degree away. I mean, all the way from, all of the famous rock and roll stars, the movie stars, the people that talked about him in articles. And that after the murders, of course, they were like, well, I've heard of him, but and they claimed to not have any connection with him. But in fact, many of them had actually been out to Spawn's ranch, had partied with him, and saw him as being this, conduit to, to an unrealized self, a real prophet. Mm-hmm. That they just didn't want to admit to later on. But it's unfortunate for them that it's still in the record. And including all of these weird Scientology connections too. So anyway, there's a couple of things I want to get to. The parts in your book are called "The Parts Left Out of the Manson Case." So this, some of this stuff is really intriguing because they are things I hadn't heard about before. Do you want to go to this Ronald Reagan Jr. connection? I mean, this is weird.
Remind me about this one.
Okay.
There's so much material in the book that my poor burned out brain sometimes has trouble retrieving some of it.
Okay, well, you don't have to. I mean, there's no reason to if you don't. I can't tell the story as well as you do. But what you get into here is, I'll read the first paragraph. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Another counterculture personality who entered the Manson family sphere was Paul Krasner, editor of The Realist. Krasner had written Manson in Prison, seeking material for a book he was working on called "The Parts Left Out of the Manson Case." "Call Squeaky," Charlie replied. To break the ice, Krasner brought along 300, and I don't know how to pronounce this, 300 mic tabs of acid. Mm-hmm. Is that short for
micrograms? Yeah.
Micrograms, which he, Squeaky, Brenda, and Sandy dropped. Coming onto the stuff, the girls sang along with the Moody Blues, as well as this new tune, "A Horse with No Name." The song's lyric, Squeaky explained, was pregnant with meaning, speaking of oceans, blah, 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 blah. So I was just saying, then he gets into a whole sex thing with them. And I was just going through this, all of the other names and all of the personalities, all the other, former or well-known people that were connected that came across the lives of Charles Manson, even after he's already been convicted.
Oh, yeah, he was interviewed by Ronald Reagan Jr.
That's what my point was, yes.
Yeah. An interesting one is Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Talk about that.
Now, I don't know how much I covered this in the new book, but recently Susan Atkins has been trying to get a compassionate release from the state of California. She's in pretty bad shape. She lost a leg, and she has inoperable brain cancer, and Governor Schwarzenegger is having no part of it. But there is a curious photo out on the web if you get on, do a Google search for Susan Atkins and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that'll bring up a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger with his arm around Susan Atkins. I believe the photo is from like the late 70s. I haven't read any explanation of it, but I assume it happened at Civil Brand Prison where they had some type of workout program, and Arnold visited this group, and you see a bunch of inmate women, I assume, surrounding Governor Schwarzenegger, and to his left is Susan Atkins, and they have their arms around each other.
And that there's some claim that the LAPD had collections of porno flicks mm-hmm. that involved some pretty famous people that wouldn't have expected to have been involved in something like that.
Yeah, and that's the story there, that Manson was set up as a kind of a scapegoat to cover up a lot of the bad juju that was going on with that whole crowd that lived in the Tate House and were associated with parties there and with big names in the rock and roll world and the movie industry. That the Manson family somehow got involved in some homemade movies that were being made of the porno and sadomasochistic style, and that was another thing that was at the core of the case.
And for a while, John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, he wasn't really a suspect in the murders, was he?
No, but Roman Polanski suspected him, and I talk about that bit in the book that he...
that Roman Polanski fingered John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas to be involved with this somehow. Yeah,
what that suggests to me is that, Phillips, and it appears to be the case, was pretty involved in that whole crowd that Manson associated with, this rock and roll movie industry crowd, and granted, Pulaski was under a lot of stress following the murders and was getting paranoid probably, and suspected somebody who was a good friend of his, John Phillips, of somehow being involved. He actually got a hold of Phillips' diary and took that to the police, as I recall the story, but nothing was ever found linking him to the crimes.
Okay. And that you think that you actually sort of see there's a connection between, say, Charles Manson and Lee Harvey Oswald or Sirhan or James Earl Ray. Mm-hmm. Talk about this as Charles Manson as a patsy. What do you mean by that?
Well, that gets pretty involved, but there was a guy named Preston Guillory who nowadays has a pretty successful PI firm, I've heard. He was with the L.A. Sheriff's Office, and he believed that Charles Manson was an agent provocateur. This was during the whole unrest of the 60s, and he had a program going on at that time called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. It was run by the FBI, and the CIA concurrently had their own program called Operation Chaos, and they would basically get agent provocateurs to infiltrate different groups like the Black Panthers and the Yippies, and this is one area I see a connection with Manson and Oswald. Oswald basically did the same thing in New Orleans prior to the JFK assassination. He infiltrated different communist groups.
Well, we'll refer everybody else from this point forward to the chapter, the Manson-Sirhan connection. It's in the book, The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. And you think that Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who later goes on to try to kill President Ford, that she too might have been part of this program?
We run out of time here. I hear music, but there's a good anecdote there with Squeaky Fromm and MK Ultra.
Well, then we'll get to that coming up next. Hang on for that. Lynette Squeaky Fromm from the Manson family, how she too might have been controlled next. And then we'll get to your questions and comments about the Manson family murders in new details with new connections that no one else I've ever heard make before, like Adam Go Rightly on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, so go ahead and grab one of the wildcard lines if you want to. We're into the conversation. The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. We're talking with Adam Go Rightly about his background and research into MK Ultra and into the potential that either Charles Manson himself or other members of his group had at one time crossed paths with the CIA mind control program. Now, that may seem a little far-fetched until you go back to a show we did, was it about a year ago, about Project Monarch, and this belief that there was a group of women that were raised to be CIA-controlled sex slaves. Even that sounds kind of crazy, but when you really get into it, you'll see that there's a history of not only women being able to verify what happened to them, but also some evidence that backs up this the existence of this Project Monarch. So we'll talk about that and how that might have intersected with Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who goes on to try to kill President Ford. Could she also have been part of this same program? Charles Manson and the rest of the Manson family continues to influence evil around the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and get your questions and comments coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So we'll get to your questions and comments here for Adam Gorightly, but let's quick finish up that story about Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who attempts to kill President Ford after the conviction already of the Manson family. And so how could that be tied into MK Ultra?
Before we talk about that, just briefly, you mentioned Project Monarch. And one alleged Project Monarch victim is a woman who uses the pseudonym of Cisco Wheeler, and she was the co-author with a guy named Fritz Springmeier of a book called The Illuminati Formula Used to Create an Undetectable Total Mind Control Slave, which is a mouthful. And anyway, in that book, they identified Manson as a monarch slave and monarch slave handler, and that he received his initial mind control programming at the China Lake Naval Station, which, by the way, is located like 45 miles or so northwest of Barker Ranch, which was the Manson family's last hideout before they got picked up for the Tate LaBianca murders. That's just a little tidbit, and just because somebody says that in a book doesn't mean it's true, but it's another one of those connecting links. Now with Squeaky Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore, there's some interesting connections. Growing up in his youth, Manson spent some time in Charleston, West Virginia, which is pretty close to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the Mothman sightings went on, where a lot of strange things have happened. A lot of people suspect there's some type of weird MK Ultra stuff involved in the Mothman story. Now, growing up there, Manson lived on the same street as Sarah Jane Moore, who attempted to assassinate Gerald Ford in the mid-'70s. Some people have suggested she was an agent provocateur, an FBI informant like Manson was. And oddly enough, the other lady who tried to assassinate Ford was none other than Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a Manson family member. So that's another very strange and illuminating connection.
Well, and that the story, as you relate it in the book, is that a witness said that they saw a woman in a polka dot dress hand the gun to Squeaky Fromm before she shot Gerald Ford. Is that correct?
Yes, and of course the girl in the polka dotted dress shows up in the RFK assassination, and there's once again some strange connections there with the Manson family.
Well, and so let's back up for a second. So the woman in the polka dot dress, the story in the RFK assassination is that one of the witnesses said that they saw somebody there who was wearing a polka dot dress, and that she was the witness insisted that she saw this woman, and then she had a central role in the assassination. What was that role? Do you remember?
In the
RFK?
Oh, well, okay. Leading up to RFK's assassination, witnesses saw Sirhan in the ambassador ballroom with this attractive young lady wearing this polka dotted dress, and that she handed him a cup of coffee from which he drank of. And during his trial, Surin claimed he had no memory of the shooting, although he did recall the events leading up to and immediately following this encounter with the girl in the polka dotted dress. And this suggests the possibility of hypnosis used in conjunction with psychoactive drugs to create a Manchurian candidate.
Well, and that there was a witness to that, which I also thought was interesting. A woman who said she saw this, and it's actually, I think they still have the tape, or at least the transcript of the police convincing her, the L.A. police convincing her she never saw anybody in a polka dotted dress.
Yeah,
and she's like, "No, I saw her," and they go, "No, you never did. Your mind is making that up." I mean, it's really weird that they're intent on telling her that she never saw anybody in a polka dotted dress. Yeah. I thought that was fascinating when I read that in another book. But
that specter lingers over that assassination. Now, get this, on June 5th, 1968. This was just prior to his assassination. Robert Kennedy and the company of, guess who, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, attended a dinner party at the Malibu home of John Frankenheimer, director of, guess the movie?
The Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah. And after supper, Frankenheimer drove Kennedy to the Ambassador Hotel.
All right, let's get to Rick, Lexington, Kentucky, east of the Rockies, for Adam Gorightly, author of The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. Go ahead, Rick.
Hello, Mr. Bonnet.
Good to hear your voice, buddy.
Long time no talk, sir.
Yeah. How's your health?
My health's fine.
Good. I was wondering
fine, pal.
I wondered if you'd fallen off the face of the earth. Every time I go to open lines, I expect to see you there, and you're not there.
Well, I've been listening.
Okay, glad to hear that. You had a question for our guest?
Yes, he talked about Springmeyer. Fritz Wheeler, the co-author of that book.
Right?
Yes. Springmeyer.
Yes, Fritz Springmeyer.
Yes.
Isn't he the co-author?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, my question, that's just what I want. One thing I wanted to know. About MK Ultra. Are you talking about the Charles Manson thing tonight?
Yep.
Joseph Mengele.
Joseph Mengele, the Nazi.
Brought over here from the Nazis in Project Paperclip.
I have heard that, yes.
Yes. And he's a mind control expert. And I understand that he was part of the Charles Manson clan.
I've never heard that one.
I've never heard that. Adam, any connection with Joseph Mengele? And thanks, Rick. Always a pleasure.
That's a new one on me, but I'd like to hear more. Of course, you talk about Mengele and MK Ultra. There have been these great rumors that with the whole Project Paperclip thing, when they brought over all the
rocket scientists,
right? That they brought over the people who developed mind control in Nazi Germany, and one of those was Dr. Mengele, who ended up over here and was using the name of Dr. Green.
Douglas, west of the Rockies in San Francisco on Coast to Coast AM. Douglas?
Hey, always good to talk to you, Mr. Ponte.
And you. Go ahead.
And Mr. Gorightly, thank you for honoring us with your presence. I just want to mention a few of my experiences at the Presidio military base as a DOD librarian that had to do with Anton LaVey and the satanic activities that were going on base, and then segue into a question concerning Jim Jones. And certainly when I worked as a librarian, I worked under the direct command several times of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who was a military intelligence officer for the Department of Defense, and he was a member of Anton LaVey's Satanic Church, which was right outside the base, right outside the Arguello Gate in San Francisco. And Anton LaVey's cousin was also held rank in the U.S. Army Reserves and was on base all the time. And Colonel Aquino, he later retired as a full-fledged colonel, he would walk around on base in full pancake makeup with clipped eyebrows and a widow's peak, saying it was freedom of religion as a Satanist that the Constitution was defending. And he looked up L. Ron Hubbard's personnel records. We had to get them through the Letterman Army Medical Center, but because he classified them as a security and intelligence issue, I was able to get access to the personnel records for him. And while I was collating the documents for him, to give the monster a kind of human face, L. Ron Hubbard served in World War II, and during the Korean War and afterwards, he was at Bikini Atoll and Inuitak, and he claimed he had a psychology degree, and apparently they accepted it, that claim. And he was supposed to analyze psychologically the atomic effects on sailors while they stood on board, exposed to the oncoming atomic wave. He contracted cancer, so he claimed he tried to sue the U.S. government, and the medical document said specifically, claim he was never there. And that's when he kind of went off the deep end and started his own religion. And Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who was also a POW of the North Koreans, later on bragged about having Bush Sr. as a member in his church, and Bush Sr. often said publicly that Reverend Moon was the man with the vision, and that he was a follower. And this is generally known in Asia, but I talk to people about it in the United States, and nobody's aware of it.
I've never heard of a Bush connection to Sun Myung Moon before, although Sun Myung Moon is a political conservative and owns the Washington Times.
He used to own the Washington Post. And yes.
Washington Post.
Yeah,
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
But Bush Sr. actually went down to South America to actually open up a Mooney colony in South America, and this was headline banner news in Japan. But,
I've never heard that. That's very interesting. Well, you had a question you wanted to get to for Adam Gorightly?
Oh, yeah, you bet. I mean, two things. I mean, one of them was a personal experience, and the other one was concerning Jim Jones, when Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino and many of the other intelligence officers on base stated that Jim Jones, who was a big figure in San Francisco politics, Willie Brown and Dianne Feinstein said he was the greatest man since Jesus walked the waves. The majority of his followers were African American from Oakland, and when they went down to Jonestown, Aquino was claiming that was a CIA, which was a totally separate department from DOD, of course. He claimed that was a CIA mass self-destruction or self-immolation experiment in mind control, and that Jim Jones apparently was one of their boys, is what Lieutenant Colonel Aquino said. And I was wondering what Mr. Gorightly's opinion was on that. And the other personal experience, in light of everything both of you have been saying about assassination, was towards the end of my career as a librarian in the DOD, a couple of clowns showed up, and I talked on the phone before after the RFK interview that George Norrie did a few months back. A lieutenant commander from the Office of Naval Intelligence came over from Norfolk, Virginia, and tried to recruit me to play a patsy, and they said it was such. They were very unflattering about it, while some snipers took out Clinton, and this was when Clinton was running for president. He was not yet an executive. He was running for president in July of 1992, and so there was all kinds of people who were involved in this farcical attempt to take down Clinton before he had a chance to become president. And of course, at that time, the man running the CIA was Bush Sr.
Let's get a response here. So hang on a second. Your thought on this? Anywhere you want to grab onto that, Adam?
The caller had a lot of interesting stuff there as far as the whole Jonestown thing and it being some type of MK Ultra project that went awry. I think the best thing to read on that is a piece by John Judge that was written quite a few years ago called Black Hole in Guyana.
And what will that be about?
Basically what the caller was suggesting, that it was some type of MK Ultra experiment, and that the all the people there in Guyana were basically sacrificed, and that the fingerprints of intelligence agencies was all over it.
Ruth is in Chatsworth, California, on Coast to Coast AM for Adam Gorightly. Ruth?
Oh, hi. I'm just absolutely fascinating. Before I actually have a story about meeting Charles Manson, but I had a question quick. some of these unusual deaths and accidents, like Terry Melcher, Jane Mansfield, who actually was beheaded in that car crash. They don't talk about that a lot. Brian Wilson's accident. A lot of these, were these actual hits rather than a supernatural? It just seems, a lot of people associated came to very bad ends in very strange ways.
Well, I talk a bit about Dennis Wilson's death in the book, and there were some curious circumstances surrounding that. I would encourage you to check out the book, but for one, the researcher, conspiracy theorist Mae Brussel felt that there was a hit taken out on Dennis Wilson to basically cover up what he knew about the Manson family murders and how deep they went.
Wow. Could these have been actual then hits, like maybe Jane Mansfield, there was a car that was set up to do just that, crash into her?
Well, Jane Mansfield is that's a whole nother story, and once again, you look into that, she was dating a guy at that time who was deeply involved with the aftermath of the JFK assassination, as I revealed. So you have these, sometimes it's just a degree or two of separation linking all these things together. Her death was very curious, and Anton LaVey claimed that he had accidentally caused her death by accidentally, as I recall the story, he had a pair of scissors and he had a photograph and accidentally cut her head off, and he thought unwittingly he had performed some type of ritual magic. As I recall the story, of course, Anton LaVey had a lot of stories, so sometimes you got to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Yeah, weird, and also weird, of course, too. That Jane Mansfield's daughter ends up becoming the television star, right, of Law and Order. Isn't that Jane Mansfield's daughter?
I wasn't aware of that.
I could have sworn that's for that. Mariska Hargitay, that's her daughter.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Interesting.
On Law and Order, who I think was but a child when that horrible thing happened.
Yeah.
Kevin is in Brooklyn on Coast to Coast AM. Hey, Kevin.
How you doing?
We may have time just for your question, and we'll get to the answer coming up after the break. But go ahead.
How you doing, Ian, Adam? MK Ultra we were talking about earlier. Didn't the Senate have a closed-door hearing on that issue of MK Ultra due to the fact that they were also involved in the experiments in the 50s with the CIA and the mind control things that went on with the LSD and other psychotropic drugs that they had used on people? Because I had worked for the New York State Department of Corrections when I got out of the Marines, right? And I had met that guy. We had searched his cell. Who killed John Lennon?
Mark David Chapman?
Yeah, he was a strange dude, and we found papers in his cell. No, we do cell searches.
Right.
And we had found papers that, and we'd read them, and it was all mysterious writings on it, Lincoln, talking about government. And they kind of, the higher authorities, the brats, as we call them, took possession of these papers, and we never heard nothing of it after that.
All right, well,
and it's like they
very interesting.
From us.
Very interesting. We're coming up on the break here, so you're going to have to hear for that response coming up. Thank you, Kevin, and we'll pick up our last half hour. Your questions and comments for Adam Go Rightly, talking about MK Ultra, satanic worship, and the Manson family, plus all of these interesting connections between Manson family members and some of the most famous assassinations of all time. And the separations just aren't that big. Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. It's such an interesting book. I can't tell you enough. The Shadow over Santa Susana, it makes connections, substantiated connections, easily to follow connections between Charles Manson and so many other cases. And it if nothing else, it just leads you to wonder, could these all be coincidences? For example, here's a totally weird collection of facts. Leading up to the assassination of RFK, Sirhan was employed as an assistant manager at a horse breeding farm owned by Desi Arnaz, of course, of I Love Lucy fame. Desi Arnaz was a staunch anti-Castro Cuban and was friends with the mobster Mickey Cohen, who in turn was buddies with Alvin Creepy Karpus, who was Manson's prison mentor. It just look at that, you go, okay, that's weird. And, that there was another connection, too, right there in the same chapter between a woman who was brought in as a character witness in a trial for one of the people connected to the RFK assassination, and it turns out that woman who was brought in as a character witness for this guy involved in the RFK assassination was the sister of Arthur Bremer, who is the guy who later goes on to attempt to assassinate George Wallace. Shut up. I mean, how small are these worlds? We'll get back to that. And they all seem to revolve in one way or another around Charles Manson. Your questions, your comments, when we get back with Adam Gorightly next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. All right, heading into this last half hour on Coast to Coast AM, we'll get to more questions and comments. And all of the connections are there in the book, The Shadow over Santa Susana. But again, remember, this is not a book for the squeamish, or maybe even, I think it's fair to say, Adam, even for the easily offended. Mm-hmm. But it's a very compellingly written collection of stories and connections to Charles Manson. Adam Gorightly is the author. And did you want to make a comment about from the gentleman from Brooklyn?
Yeah, he was saying that he worked in a prison where Chapman was incarcerated and found documents there that Chapman had written saying there was some type of government involvement. Don't really have anything to add. That doesn't surprise me, to play the devil's advocate. A lot of times people who are paranoid think the government's at them, so I try to keep an open mind, skeptical mind about this stuff. Another thing, you were talking about Sirhan Sirhan. It should be noted that for many years at Corcoran State Prison in Central California, where Charlie is housed, his next-door neighbor was Sirhan Sirhan.
Wait.
Yeah.
Next-door neighbor at the prison
Yeah.
to Charles Manson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's after the assassination.
Oh, yes.
Okay, fine. Okay, because that would have been even weirder if that had happened. Okay, so after they're both convicted of their respective crimes, they end up being next door neighbors. Well, didn't they one time share a lawyer or something like that? Didn't Sirhan Sirhan wasn't he represented by the same law firm that Charles Manson had tried to use at one point before he even got out of prison? I thought.
I think there was a connection there with Tex Watson, but there's a lot of connections, once again, between people who worked as lawyers and prosecutors in the RFK assassination, the Tate LaBianca murder trial, and the JFK assassination.
It's fascinating. Let's get to John in Palm Springs on Coast to Coast AM. John, your question for Adam Gorightly.
Oh, that's incredible that you include me. Thank you. I just want to ask him what he thinks of what I'm about to tell him. I see it. I was under the senior commander, David Ferry, in the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol Squadron, same one that Oswald came out of. David was a master hypnotist. It's just my opinion to tell you tonight that I would more readily draw a parallel between Manson and Ferry, not between Manson and Oswald, because Oswald was more the patsy, the follower to David Ferry, as his, Manson's followers, patsies, were to Manson. That's the only reason I called, to draw a more direct sequitur line between the two.
If this were an SAT college question, it would be David Ferry is to Oswald as Charles Manson is to whom, right? I mean, that would be like, and your point was well taken. That's interesting. I didn't know that David Ferry was a master hypnotist, but boy, that sure wouldn't surprise me either, Adam.
Oh, yeah, I have heard that about Ferry. Yes, Ferry was involved in
a lot of stuff. There's even some theories, and we're getting way out there, that he didn't actually die when he was reported to die sometime after the Kennedy assassination, and that he later showed up in Point Pleasant during the whole Mothman thing. But
okay, now there's no way. There's no way he ends up being part of the.
I can put you in touch with people who.
All right. Well, I don't know that I believe them either. Let me get to Larry in Sacramento on Coast to Coast, grabbing questions for Adam Gorightly, author of The Shadow over Santa Susana. Larry?
Yes, Ian. Very quickly, I have a short statement that ends in a question. My wife and I have owned our own business for over 30 years, and we would hire newly released inmates to work at our company to try to help them get on their feet. One of the inmates we hired, a very, very dangerous man, bunked or was a cellmate of Charlie Manson in Folsom Prison for several years. He said that Charlie Manson, as we have all noticed from interviews, Charles Manson, because he felt, as many violent people do, felt he was so vastly superior to any authoritative figure that he would spin tales and get satisfaction from them getting hooked and following his bony tail. Anyway, he told this cellmate that Helter Skelter was just a tale. He liked the word. But the real reason that they went to Sharon Tate's residence, I'm sorry, I forget her husband's name.
Roman Polanski.
Yeah, Roman Polanski. And leading some credence to that, Roman Polanski was convicted of drugging and raping his 15-year-old, and they had to leave the country. So he had a high sleaze factor. Getting to the question, Charles Manson said the real reason they went there, and his connections were mainly like cocktail party Hollywood types, that these girls, he had a long string that he would provide to stars' cocktail parties just as girls to have there and pass around.
Right.
And that Roman Polanski used Charles Manson several times with his string and then burned him and refused to pay. So to get even, that's why they went and offed him and did all that horrible stuff.
They didn't kill him, but they went to kill. Right.
Oh yeah. And
interesting.
That's the real. The Helter Skelter was just a entertaining spin that he could mislead people so much dumber than him.
All right. Well, let's ask Larry. Thank you. What do you think of that, Adam? Any part of that sound right?
Well, it kind of rings true in a sense, but I have no documentation that Polanski was involved with, young women with the Manson family. The whole thing about Helter Skelter being some sort of fantasy, that's what Charlie himself has said, that Bugliosi basically constructed that whole theory to convict Charlie, and that others have said that he did that to cover up the true facts behind the case. Once again, that it involved all these music and movie people, and the story goes much deeper than the surface tale of the whole Helter Skelter.
Well, and while I've got you for a second, and we'll have time, I think, for all of the questions that are up on the screen, so I'm not taking anything away from anybody, but that there was some story that Charles Manson was also a hitman for the mob. Do we have anything to substantiate that with? Once again, it's tying those threads together, but in prison, some of his mentors were mobsters. We talked about Frankie Carbo was one of them, and there was a couple others. Now, LaBianca, prior to his death, had debts to the mob. He liked to go out to the racetrack and owned money in Vegas to Frankie Carbo's organization. And there's been researchers who've looked into that, and who, their whole theory and contention is that Manson basically
pulled a hit for the mob.
My connection with the studio just went down, so I'm going to ask Jesse to tell me who is next on line 2, wild card line 2. Jesse? Okay, Jeremy is in Placerville on Coast to Coast AM, and you're going to have to bring up Jeremy because I can't make the connection here. Go ahead. Jeremy, you had a question for Adam Gorightly?
Yes, sir. I want to know how connected Charlie Manson was with the Aleister Crowley.
How connected he was to Aleister Crowley. We did talk about that a little bit earlier.
You know, I had a bit of a brain fade before when you brought that up, Ian, and I guess the connection there is with a group called the Solar Lodge OTO that
the
Manson,
OTO,
was allegedly involved with during the same period he was involved with the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Those are some kind of tenuous links, but there's some interesting stuff there. I don't have any smoking gun though that connects them.
Well, take a look at that in the book The Shadow over Santa Susana, because there are some stronger portions there about Aleister Crowley. I'm gonna have to. I don't know why the internet's down, but it is. So,
hey, Ian,
Josie's in Wisconsin. Coming up in just a second. Go ahead, Adam.
Oh, I wonder if I could do a short plug.
Go ahead.
I'm doing a book signing, and I'll make some people mad if I don't mention this. This is going to be at Soap Plant Waco La Luz de Jesus Gallery in Hollywood on August 9th, which is the 40th anniversary of the murders. I'm going to give a lecture there, and some buddies of mine, a band called the Flying Sorcerers, are going to play some music, and I want to give a shout out to my agent, Scott Moody, for setting that up, and also getting this book reissued. And if you want to find out more about other events I'm doing, go to my blog, which is gorightly.wordpress.com.
Let's get to Josie in Wisconsin. We were just talking about Wisconsin in the first hour, with new attention being paid to the Beast of Bray Road. It's very interesting. If you missed that, go back in the podcast through Streamlink. Josie, you had a question for Adam Gorightly?
Yes. I was wondering if Bugliosi had any input in his book, and also I have a couple of comments. Did anyone ever tell you, Ian, that you sound like Jonathan Alter?
No, I know who he is, though.
Because I'm a first-time caller, and I've been listening for about 8 months, so I'm fairly new and hooked.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad.
Pardon me?
People have said I sound like the guy that's in Grand Theft Auto, that there's a disc jockey in Grand Theft Auto, and I sound like him. So that's the only one I've heard. So thank you.
I have no clue about that, because I sound young, but I'm older. But I wanted to make another comment about that Dakota and that Rosemary's Baby movie. You guys thought it was a man that had been thrown out in the movie onto the, from the building
window?
there. Right. In actuality, it was an actress named Vicky Vetri, but she went by Angela Dorian as a stage name, and I knew her all my life. I grew up in Hollywood, California, and we kind of always were in the same area, and she was beautiful. She was a Playmate of the Year in 1968, and that was one of the things that she was awarded. She was awarded. Pardon me?
So, but help me understand. So the actress herself committed suicide?
Oh, no. She was the one that was...
Played the character.
First one murdered in Rosemary's Baby.
That's fine. I just wanted to understand. So she was the first one murdered in Rosemary's Baby.
And I knew her all as I was growing up in California. And she also played in that movie. It was BC or something, where they made her. She was Italian, and they made her into a blonde. But it was about dinosaurs. It was kind of a silly movie. But
that's the one with Raquel Welch in it too, I think. Actually, now that I think about it, but very interesting. And then one last quick comment. Did you have one more? Nope. Okay, then let's answer the question that came up first there, Adam.
She asked me if Vincent Bugliosi had input into the in my book. There's no direct input, but of course I've read all of the books on the case pretty thoroughly, and his book Helter Skelter is a major source.
Well, and you're pretty generous with the references to Vincent Bugliosi in the book, but I think what you do here in The Shadow over Santa Susana is you really put, at the risk of using an inappropriately grisly kind of metaphor, but you really put flesh on the bones of this story in really dimensional ways that I just never encountered before, and I thought you really did a really nice job in the research, pulling all these strange things together. And yeah, maybe 70% of these are coincidences. I don't know, but it's just hard to, page after page after page of one Hollywood star, one music person, one political person that all keep kind of weaving around Charles Manson. It's very compelling. Jesse, who's next? Let's get to Victor in Seattle on Coast to Coast AM. Victor, you might be last, but I'm working hard. Go ahead, Victor.
I was wondering if Marilyn Monroe was co-related to any of this. And I'll take my answer off the air.
Thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
There'd be a few degrees of separation, I guess, if you link the Manson family to Manson family murders to the JFK assassination, but
or RFK.
Yeah,
for that
RFK
matter
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because of the ongoing association with RFK, and that he took Marilyn Monroe as a lover to console her after JFK had broken up with her. Well,
give me enough time and I could link it all together. Yeah,
it really is weird like that, and it some of them are just not very tortured at all. I mean, the connections, the unusual connections, even between the victims. I mean, how many times did some of these people cross paths before one ended up killing the other one? Mm-hmm. And the number of Hollywood people or famous music people that even after he was already identified as being a killer and a leader of an ugly family, that they still wanted to associate themselves with it. Well, we don't have time for everything left. Obviously, you hear the music playing in the background. I'll leave the rest up to you. Was Charles Manson Charles Mann's son, as some people in the family thought of him, as being like the son of man, like a Jesus figure? Not to me. And I don't see how we can make that connection with somebody who brought so much pain into the world. But he was the son of something. And there's no surprise that somehow he ends up being connected to the son of Sam and other murders as well. And thank you for doing such great detailed work, and have a terrific night. Adam Gorightly, good luck with your book signing coming up, okay?
Thank you very much, Ian.
I enjoyed it quite a bit. Good, thank you.
Personal Jesus. and touch faith. Feeling alone and you're all alone. Flesh and bone by the telephone. Lift up the receiver, I'll make you a believer. I will deliver, you know I'm a forgiver. Yeah, reach out and touch faith. Trust in all Jesus. Reach out and touch faith. Reach out and touch faith. Yeah, reach out and touch faith. Reach out and touch faith. Reach out and touch faith.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left. My children are coming.